The 8th of August, 2014. In New York, an enology myth collapses. The court sentenced one of the most flamboyant characters in the wine world to 10 years imprisonment. It was the trial of the United States versus Rudy Kurniawan, 37, who became the largest wine forger of all time. He was gifted with extraordinary abilities, with a far more developed palate than the average person. For years, he put this gift to use for an international scam. He managed to sell an astronomical amount of bottles of the best vintages on the market, all recreated by himself. A fraud that amounted to tens of millions of dollars. It took the obstinacy of all the world's leading experts, such as Michael Egan, to successfully bring down the genius swindler.
I think Rudy Kurniawan had a great eye for detail and a great understanding of what constituted an old bottle. So I think he was quite a genius.
Rudy Kurniawan, a very mysterious man with multiple identities whose past we know nothing about. Out of nowhere, with 9 different passports in hand, he became a master at the game of deception. We're going to tell you the story of this chameleon who infiltrated the wine world at a spectacular speed and eluded the American Justice Department for almost a decade.
He was manipulative because he knew how to develop that persona that would give him credibility in the very fine wine world, which would then allow him to sell extraordinarily large quantities of wine, and people would trust him because of it.
A complete mystery still exists around Rudy Kurniawan. Nothing is known about his past. Nothing is known about his personality.
One man spent several years of his life hunting him down.
Not bad.
Nothing predestined this seemingly dandyish winemaker to become a shock detective. This French wine producer found himself at the center of one of the biggest scandals ever seen in the history of wine, because Rudy Kurniawan made the mistake of copying one of his rarest vintages. To flush him out, Laurent Ponceau tracked him around the world.
It was a good imitation. The labels were made from the same paper using the same ink. The logo was very well reproduced, which was complicated. It was a substantial job.
We've attempted to unravel the Kurniawan mystery. To lift the veil on this enigmatic personality, we've managed to meet some key witnesses to this romantic story who have never before spoken about it on television. The New York attorney who followed the case. The leading expert who has analyzed hundreds of fake bottles. All agreed to tell us the details of their investigation. Douglas Barzilay was the first collector to have expressed doubts over the authenticity of Kurniawan certified wines. Jerome Mooney, the forger's lawyer, will be his spokesman. All of them crossed paths with this wine expert. Behind this exterior hid a man who was full of contradictions and seeking recognition. An investigation into an incredible story which will take us all over the world. Dive into the secret world of Rudy Kurniawan. The first known traces of Rudy Kurniawan date back to early 2000, under the Californian sun in Woodland Hills, an outlying district of Los Angeles, an hour's drive from the city center. It was here, in this renowned wine shop, that the incredible story of the young Asian seemed to start. He was 24 years old when he pushed open the store's door, a bottle of wine in hand. The young Rudy Kurniawan, shy, headed for reception. He hadn't come to buy some wine, but to sell his bottle. Kyle would become very close to the young man. He agreed to go back to the path of Rudy Kurniawan for the first time on camera.
Showed up one day and he was a very young kid, probably in his young 20s. His first request to me was that he had bought a good deal of 1998 California Cabernets from another merchant, and he came to find out that that was not a good vintage and wanted to sell them to me.
Kyle didn't imagine at the time he was dealing with someone who would become the greatest wine forger in history. Beneath his naive exterior, the young Rudy seemed, at this point, to simply want to deepen his knowledge on Grand Cru. His visits to the shop increased. He asked the seller many questions. So Kyle and his colleague Paul Wasserman, one of California's most renowned wine experts, became friends with this very curious young man. Rudy wanted to know everything about French wines, their taste, their grape varieties, and their vinification. It was good timing. The two sellers are encyclopedic.
Paul Wasserman, the great Burgundy taster, was part of our team, and we started to encourage him to venture out into Burgundy.
I think Rudy was a person looking for something in life that could be important to him and something that he could excel at, something that he was better at than other people. And he began to see, Rudy Kurniawan, can be somebody important in particular circles.
Rudy progressed very quickly. In just 6 months, his palate had developed spectacularly. The student proved gifted. His senses were overdeveloped, and his ability to remember far higher than average. He'd taste, smell, savor, and take notes to memorize the aromas, colors, vintages, and Grand Cru. A godsend he would later exploit.
He had an exceptional memory. He knew the Bordeaux and Burgundy appellations by heart, while there are over 100 appellations on a small strip of land.
There's actually like a scientific word for this group of people called super tasters, who actually have a higher, density of taste buds than most people. I'm not sure what the exact percentage is, but it's a small percentage. And then the percentage of those who happen to gravitate towards wine as their way to express that talent, is even smaller.
Rudy Kurniawan did not only improve his knowledge of wine, he also questioned his two mentors on the great French vintages market, in search of the nuggets still not recognized in the United States. At this point, it was the Grand Cru from Bordeaux which were in. In the early 2000s, only a handful of Americans bet on Burgundy. This was the case of Douglas Barsley, one of the first renowned collectors who wanted to make his compatriots discover great Burgundy wines. He is a key witness in our story because he would play an active role in the rise and fall of Kurniawan.
Gradually, as I started tasting Burgundies and got more and more excited about them and the quality and how interesting they were, and some of the complexities of trying to figure Burgundy out, I came more and more. When I started buying wines for myself, probably the large majority of my cellar was Bordeaux, and today it's mostly Burgundy. And a lot of other people in the US have been making that same transition.
In 2001, the young 25-year-old Rudy understood that this new Burgundy trend could be very lucrative. So he decided to specialize in wine from the region. To do this, he had to meet as many fans as possible of these beverages, which were still rare in the United States. He asked his friend Kyle Smith to introduce him to his very exclusive tasting club. In great restaurants like this one, Il Grano, one of Los Angeles' best Italian restaurants, a dozen connoisseurs would meet. Thanks to Kyle Smith, our young prodigy timidly took his first steps into the very closed world of the city's finest palates.
We formed a Burgundy tasting group in Los Angeles that comprised 12 of the top tasters in the city. It's called the Berg Whores. And we invited him to be part of that. So that's when his first real initiation into Burgundy began.
From the start, Rudy was a sensation. Even if he had no enological training, in a game of blind tasting, this self-taught man came dangerously close to perfection. He realized he could make something of his genius. Was an idea starting to form in his mind? In any case, Rudy was an obsessive perfectionist. So to continue to develop his abilities, he was coming to the little shop in Woodland Hills daily and starting to build up a lovely wine cellar. These bottles were stored in his home, in Arcadia, a quiet residential neighborhood in the north of Los Angeles. The rather inconspicuous young man shared this modest house with his mother, a place he seemed to want to preserve, even with his new knowledge. Kyle is the only one who was ever invited there for a drink, and he was surprised by the rather strange attitude of the young man that day.
We were having dinner out in his neighborhood, which is it's a Chinese neighborhood. After dinner, he invited me back to the house. And when we went to the front door, I'll never forget this. He stops me and says, "Dude," this is how he speaks. "Dude, when you come into the house, don't freak out when you see what wines I have in there, because my mom thinks they're all $20 or less." So I thought that was kind of interesting. So yeah, we went in his house and we had a couple bottles of wine. I had no reason to suspect he was manufacturing wines out of his house at this point.
Yet it was here, barely hidden, that Rudy started to develop his plans for the biggest scam ever seen in the wine world. If Kyle couldn't find anything suspicious that day, he realized one thing, that these bottles did not cost $20, as Rudy seemed to be making his mother believe.
His average bottle price was probably $400 or $500 a bottle, so he probably bought $500,000 with us for the first year.
In late 2001, Rudy had formed a collection worth a small fortune. Rather strange for a young, unemployed 25-year-old man. So where was the money he was spending so lavishly coming from? The young man remained vague. He was very discreet about his private life, and a huge mystery hung over the source of his money.
He intentionally kept it dark. Originally, his story, to me at least, was that his family was involved in liquor distribution in Hong Kong and Indonesia, and that's where the money came from.
He seemed to have family money that was coming in, millions of dollars, and he said to people, basically, "I'm a trust fund baby," meaning this money comes in, my family sort of kicked me out, they told me to come here, and as long as I stay here in California, I'll have $1 million a month to spend.
But in reality, his life was far more obscure. Rudy wasn't clear when it came to revealing elements of his childhood or his past. At times, he presented himself as an Indonesian annuitant who'd come to the United States to study. Another time, it was to become a golfer, or because he was a political exile, versions which changed regularly, a shaky or even confused history. But strangely, nobody worried about it. His lawyer, Mr. Jerome Mooney, exceptionally agreed to go back to the case. he is still defending the thesis of a spoiled child who could buy himself anything.
The family had money, and the family had sent money to him. So the first $4 or $5 million that he spent on buying wine was money that came from the family. I suspect, from what I've seen, that he was being provided with money, more like maybe $1 million or $2 million a year, which is still a lot of money.
This young 25-year-old man earned a lot of money, and quickly, openly, and publicly. And the place he spent most of it was in auctions, where the most expensive nectars could be found. So he soon became indispensable.
I already have 350. Bravo!
The best vintages, being rare in their very essence, are very speculative products. Prices can quickly soar, especially with very wealthy connoisseurs. Auctions can reach up to tens of thousands of dollars. In this environment, Rudy quickly stood out. He had a killer technique to intimidate his opponents, raising this little panel, the paddle, to continually outbid. Like in this photo in 2001. The witnesses to these kind of sales remember a compelling young man who never went unnoticed.
He would just raise his paddle and not make it clear he was not going to put it down till he won the wine.
So if anybody raised the bid, he automatically had the next bid up.
He was not yet known in the wine community, but that's when he started to be known because everyone was just kind of like, who's this guy?
Nobody imagined at that time that he would become one of the biggest forgers in history. In 2002, at just 26, Rudy Kurniawan became a key figure in the environment. Everyone was talking about him. Nothing seemed to stop him in his frantic race. He was spending lavishly on his collection of fine wines, which was already presented as California's greatest. He even called his cellar Magic. In just 2 years, he had made his name in wine. And that was just the beginning. He would make the acquaintance of a certain John Capon, a young New York auctioneer, barely older than him. This meeting would change everything.
John Capon came out of nowhere. John Capon started writing emails about tastings he would have with Rudy. And all the magnificent wines that Rudy would pour. So it was a symbiotic relationship between the two of them.
That was the beginning of Rudy's thinking, yes, not only can I buy wines, not only can I offer wines to groups of sophisticated collectors, but I can be a big player in the auction market for wine.
Thanks to John Capon, Rudy understood that he could turn his passion into a huge business. He wanted to become the biggest dealer in history, but for that, he would need to leave Los Angeles. The largest auction houses breaking all the records on the West Coast were in Manhattan. In the winter of 2003, Rudy was 27 when he flew to New York. Upon his arrival, he headed to the Upper East Side, the richest area of the city. It was here, in one of Manhattan's most exclusive streets, that he met John Capon. The man was the head of a renowned auction house, Acker Merrill Condit, one of the oldest U.S. institutions. Helped by his new partner, John Capon, Rudy aspired to attack the New York wine market. A booming market.
This was at the time in the 2000s where money was flowing in New York, where collectors were buying bottles for insane prices. In 5 years, between 2002 and 2007, the rare wine market tripled, going from $90 million to $300 million. There was a lot of money at this time.
In the most prestigious places, on the tables of New York's luxurious restaurants, great wines were a must, and tasting clubs formed one after the other. Paul Altoona, one of the city's most respected sommeliers, saw groups of young billionaires walking through his restaurant and spending excessively by buying the world's finest bottles.
They'd have lunches or dinners here that would quickly escalate.
Meaning?
Meaning that they could bring some wines like that, and then after the wine helping, also at their passion and their enthusiasm, they'd start to order. Here, why not taste that, and that, and that, and that? It can reach huge proportions. I regularly had tables of 4 with bills of $70,000, $80,000.
Rudy wanted to target this golden youth of Manhattan to sell bottles from his famous magic cellar. In 2004, thanks to John Capon, he managed to integrate probably the most wealthy group of tasters in the city. They were 12 wealthy people in their 30s who called themselves the 12 Angry Men. Each member adopted a superhero name, such as Big Boy or the Punisher. Every week they competed to max out their gold cards. By joining the club, Rudy also chose himself a pseudonym and became Dr. Conti, in reference to his favorite wine, the Romanée Conti, the most expensive in the world. In these limitless parties, the Grand Cru were paraded: Petrus, Romanée Conti, Chateau Latour, La Tache, Lafite. They were barely uncorked before they were already replaced. Doug Barsley, the great collector of Burgundy wine, was invited to these Dionysian parties several times, and this odd game still leaves a bitter taste in his mouth.
There were these huge parties, and people would open Jeroboams of Romanée Conti, and they'd pour them around, and then it would be, the sort of thing where you had to dump out your glass of La Tache because the Romanée Conti was coming, and it's ridiculous. After maybe 2 experiences, I stopped going.
It was like a cockfight, the way you put one chicken up against another in a fight in a ring, they would put one old bottle up against another bottle in a ring.
The members of the group loved bragging indecently about their excess on the internet. They brandished the bottles like trophies, which they posted on their blogs. The provocative Rudy also didn't hesitate to show off on the net. And not just anywhere. On the site of the famous wine critic Robert Parker, considered as the most influential in the world. On the 24th of October 2004, he recounted his exploits: 4 intensive days of wine tasting with his group. I just had a wonderful time in New York with some great friends. The great John Capon was slumped on the sofa, eyes closed, but his hands continued to hold on to a 1962 wine a little awkwardly. That's why he's the great John Capon. And if he copied the habits of his new millionaire friends, it was to blend into their environment. Rudy was fascinated by these young, rich 30-somethings. So to become like them, he gradually transformed. Like a chameleon, he adopted the same gestures, imitated their mannerisms, copied their dress codes, and slowly changed his appearance.
Rudy was driving, I think, Lamborghinis and, wearing white leather jackets. I mean, he was kind of a flashy, quiet but flashy character.
He was buying suits, he was buying jewelry, he was buying whatever he bought, but he lived the good life. Well, it's something about the chameleon changing its colors, He instinctively knew which psychological buttons to push in people to make them his friends.
He gradually slipped into the skin of this wealthy character and easily integrated himself into this flashy environment. Rudy, the lonely young man, increasingly gained confidence.
One way of getting rid of shyness is to take on the guise of someone else, making yourself rich, beautiful, etc.
And this new character would become more and more arrogant. In 1 year, he got the upper hand on the group and even became the leader of the 12 Angry Men. In 2005, the young 29-year-old collector fascinated many and became the icon of this generation of high rollers. His technique to retain power, to bring increasingly rare bottles to the dinners.
It's interesting, the 12 Angry Men, Rudy was sort of the leader. He was the leader, really, and they all admired him. And it was again, oh, here comes Rudy. Rudy's coming to this dinner. What's Rudy going to bring? What incredible old wine that none of us have ever seen before will he bring?
Someone who said, "You're looking for the best vintages, but I know how we can have them." He's someone you want to trust, because it's not simply confidence that he shows. It's the fact that you want to trust in them because they render a service and because they are the people realizing our dreams.
But what does it take to make people dream? Behind the bidding up of ever more prestigious bottles, there was certainly an explanation. It was at this time Rudy developed a rather surprising obsession, which should have set off a warning. After each tasting, he asked for the empty bottles to be returned to him.
Rudy would say to the sommelier, the wine director, "I want those bottles back, those empty bottles. Please FedEx them to my home in Arcadia. I want you to be sure to wash them clean, but not to cause any damage to them."
He was so insistent that he would go as far as getting angry at a restaurant, for example, which had sent out poorly packaged and broken bottles. This was something that would set him off, that the bottles were broken.
Kyle Smith would be a witness to this strange behavior. After a dinner, he took a bottle of Romanée Conti away with him. Kyle would then discover a side of Rudy which he didn't know. For a simple empty bottle, his friend went into a rage. Very intriguing.
He poured this at a tasting. After the tasting, that he hosted, and he provided this bottle, I took the bottle, and he found out that I took the bottle and left me threatening phone calls to get the bottle back.
If Rudy reacted like this, it's because these empty bottles were, for him, of key importance. These corpses of bottles actually played a decisive role in the constitution of his famous magic cellar. Not so magical after all, because although Rudy was showing off in New York, he continued to live in Los Angeles, and in his home in Arcadia, he created a craft workshop in his kitchen to constantly bring out these astounding bottles. Michael Egan is the world's best fraud expert. No detail escapes him. He would be the one who managed to prove the guilt of the forger by removing his counterfeiting techniques one by one. He spoke of highly sophisticated methods.
Well, the most basic, the easiest way of committing a fraud is just to substitute one wine with another. That means you have a bottle of wine and you just put another label on it and sell it as such. But Mr. Kurniawan really went to the nth degree in creating some very reasonable looking fakes.
So how did he create these fine wines from scratch? His modus operandi was seemingly very simple. After retrieving his empty bottles, he filled them with a combination of several wines. Using a funnel, he poured gallons of wine. He dosed, readjusted, and tasted his beverages. It was thanks to his incredible taste and olfactory memory that he could reproduce the taste of the world's biggest wines.
He has perhaps one of the best palates that the world had seen in many, many years. He could figure out how to find the bottles with other things, of other wines, and bring them together to recreate the taste of the wine that doesn't exist anymore.
Like a 3-star chef, he had his own recipes for each of the bottles he wanted to recreate. For a Romanée Conti, for example, his guilty pleasure, he knew that by mixing several Californian wines, he could manage to find the same taste as that of his favorite nectar.
We also saw other wines from the Napa Valley, Pinot Noir, which had 40s/50s DRC, leading to the fact that he could actually use this wine in creating a wine from the Domaine de la Romanée Conti from the 1940s or 50s.
I tasted his wines. When you taste blindly like that, all alone, it's virtually impossible to think that wasn't it. because the color matched the age. The taste was correct. It was very difficult, and that's why he was doing this for so long and was never caught.
After he loaded the contents into his container, the label came first. Using photocopying and editing software, Rudy the perfectionist managed to recreate the labels of the oldest wines.
He actually treated the labels to make them look older, and we saw a lot of labels that he was experimenting on in his house, either by putting them in the oven or putting liquids on them, just to get that right degree of antiquity.
Last crucial step, the cork. Thanks to a blade corkscrew, Rudy emptied and refilled bottles without ever piercing the cork. All that remained was to put wax around it for the illusion to be perfect. In this document, seized after Rudy Kurniawan's arrest, the names of the rarest Grand Cru are listed. A kind of to-do list, an inventory of the vintages to be reproduced. But perhaps he should have been more careful. Over the months, the forger perfected and tested his creations on his acolytes. Then, in late 2005, he was finally ready to launch his global scam. In 2006, Rudy was a young 30-year-old. He'd been collecting bottles for 6 years now. He would make a big scam, selling a part of his collection. Thanks to John Capon, Rudy organized 2 anthological sales, which he called The Cellar. 2 sales at 6-month intervals, with all the elites of the wine world present, the most influential critics, and the biggest collectors ready to put down their money to catch a glimpse of Kurniawan's magical cellar.
I was at both auctions, it was a bit of a sensation at the time. There were a lot of wines. Well, it was this emerging class of collectors that I've talked about, people who were very interested in buying the greatest wines in the world and serving them at various parties and events.
Wines provided by Rudy Kurniawan, and which came out from what was known at the time as the Magic Cellar. This cellar in which Rudy Kurniawan found bottles people hadn't heard of in years. Romanée Conti 45, 47, 62, Chateau Petrus 1920, etc.
People flocked to these exceptional sales because the collector would put more than 12,000 bottles up for sale, each one rarer than the next. Too exceptional to be true. Some details would tip off the ear of the finest connoisseurs.
The Domaine Romanée Conti, which is one of the largest estates in Burgundy, is a great Burgundy vintage. In 1945, they produced 600 bottles. The vast majority of these bottles were consumed in the years that followed 1945. A few dozen bottles were able to survive. Aubert de Verlaine, the estate manager, said that in his life he'd never seen a bottle of Romanée Conti 45, while Rudy Kurniawan had 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 bottles. So there was a problem.
Despite these real incongruities, the plan worked perfectly. These 2 sales earned Kurniawan and John Capon, the auctioneer, over $35 million. A historic record in the wine world. Except the vast majority of these wines were fake, and a few months later, the first doubts became established. Especially at the opening of some bottles, they allowed a beverage to be discovered that was very far from living up to expectations.
And one of my friends was a fairly large buyer at these auctions, and a group of us had decided that we should have a tasting of the Roumier wines that he'd bought. Out of 11 wines we tasted, 6 were clearly fake. How many fake wines might be coming through here?
But even if in the wine world some people were starting to have real doubts, Kurniawan continued his unscrupulous business. In April 2008, another auction offered several lots from Rudy's cellar. He then made a big mistake that aroused the suspicions of Douglas Barzelay, the expert on Burgundy wine. An event that would mark the starting point of the forger's fall.
I saw some old Ponceau wines, and I came to some old, very old close-endonese from the 1960s and 1950s. And my first thought was, wow, I've never seen those before. And I was intrigued. And then I thought, wait a minute, I've never seen that before. And when did they start making it?
To get to the bottom of it, on the 23rd of April 2008, he decided to join his friend Laurent Ponceau, 9,000 kilometers from home in the middle of Burgundy, in the heart of the Gold Coast vineyards. The owner of this famous beverage was surprised by an email he received.
Douglas Barsley asked me, how long have you been producing Clos Saint-Denis? This question called out to me. I didn't answer him directly, but I asked him why he was asking me that question. And he told me because in 2 days in New York, there's an auction in which there are some Clos Saint-Denis 45, 47, 49, 59s, and so on. My heart skipped a beat because we'd only started producing this particular appellation in 1982.
Laurent Ponceau had never before heard of Rudy Kurniawan, his reputation, or his famous magic cellar. Nevertheless, he was certain that something was amiss in New York. So he called the sales representative and happened upon John Capon, the auctioneer.
He answered me very dismissively. All the bottles have been authenticated by experts. So I asked, who are these experts? If you could give me their names. He answered me, I am the main one. I asked him if he knew who he was talking to. At that point, I was, how to put this, short with him on the phone. He reluctantly told me that he agreed to withdraw the wines from the sale. However, it was a yes that seemed to be a diplomatic yes to me. Oh well, since I told him yes, he'll calm down and then we'll talk some more about it. That concerned me. The next day I made the decision to head to New York.
Laurent Ponceau jumped on the first plane. Just 2 days after he was alerted, he landed in New York. On the 25th of April 2008, he arrived just in time to attend the auction which had just started. There he discovered the catalogue in which Rudy Kurniawan was offering 100 bottles from Domaine Ponceau. All of it was estimated at more than $1 million. Among them, the winemaker assessed that only one was authentic. The rest were just copies of his finest wines. In other words, fakes.
When somebody told Capon that I was there, because we'd never seen each other, so he didn't know who I was, he was forced to say at the point when the Ponceau wines came up for sale that at the request of the vineyard, with the agreement of the owner, all these wines would be withdrawn from the sale.
So to understand, he asked to meet the owner of these wines. The appointment was set up for lunch the next day. Around the table, Laurent Ponceau, Douglas Barsley, John Capon, and Rudy Kurniawan.
Very quickly, even before ordering, the question that was hanging on my lips came out, and I asked the two men sitting in front of me, where did these bottles come from? Where did you buy these bottles? And like one man, they shoved their noses into their plates and mumbled a few words saying, we don't know, we buy so many wines. Kurniawan especially was saying, I buy so much wine that I can't recall, I'll have to check my records, and this and that. And in that second, I knew he was someone who wanted to hide something. He'd been described to me as someone cheerful, very urban, civil, who was always comfortable with everyone. But that day he was very withdrawn and reserved, a bit haughty.
Alerted by Rudy Kurniawan's suspicious attitude, Laurent Ponceau was now determined to find what was hiding behind this strange collector. He started by searching the Los Angeles coast, and very soon discovered that the forger was ordering labels from a commercial printer in large quantities. He realized that he was on the right track.
I learned that he was very fond of antique paper, so I tried to understand how. I found an antique paper supplier. He also had paper delivered directly from Japan, things like that. The paper used to print the labels, of course. I did it quite naively as a kind of Don Quixote on the Windmill Road. I was looking for information. I was trying to understand who he was and what he was doing. I walked almost all over the world because there were links that took me to Asia, one to Europe. So I try to follow these links for 2 years.
2 years during which the winemaker led his investigation worldwide alone and spent hours looking for the slightest detail and the slightest mistake that could incriminate the scammer. But it was impossible to pin him down. Meanwhile, Rudy Kurniawan felt the change coming. Since the sale interrupted by Laurent Ponceau, his reputation was tarnished, and he no longer managed to sell any bottles under his identity. He took on an assumed name. On this document recovered from an auction, Rudy Kurniawan poses as one Antonio Castanos to try and sell the bottles. What he didn't know was that the FBI was starting to get interested in him. Jason Hernandez was the New York prosecutor for the case. Alongside the FBI, he began a lengthy investigation.
In this case, we retrieved bank records to see where the flow of money that Rudy was getting was coming from and going to. We subpoenaed records to see what wines he was purchasing. Rudy was doing things that were highly, highly suspicious.
In 2010, to expand their investigation, the prosecutor and the FBI called Laurent Ponceau. Alone in his corner, the Frenchman was the one who'd collected the most information on Rudy.
Their investigations had begun to overlap with mine, but I had probably 80% more elements than they did, which were the elements used to arrest Rudy Kurniawan.
They pooled their research together for 2 more years. Every week, the investigation advanced a little and the evidence accumulated, with a few big mistakes. Some estates in Burgundy were then asked to cross-check information.
The evidence which they happened upon was of a vintage that Rudy Kurniawan had printed at a time when it wasn't produced. There it was so obvious that it was a fake, because my grandfather had bought the vineyard of an estate, which was the Domaine Belloger in Bonnemar in 1952. Kurniawan had already made 1923, 1928, 29, 45 labels saying formerly Domaine Belloger, which was impossible since the purchase and thus the production of the wine only took place from the 52 vintage.
At the beginning of 2012, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to bring down Rudy Kurniawan. They were about to arrest the biggest counterfeiter in history.
He was buying supplies that could be used to make counterfeit wine, like wax. And we found emails where he would inquire about the company that sells the wax. He would even email the company and ask them, is the wax that you sell like brittle old French wax? So once we were able to piece together many of these pieces, the picture became clearer. He was not just buying wine, but he was manufacturing these wines.
Rudy was finding it increasingly difficult to sell his bottles. In the circuit, tongues were wagging and the auctions were increasing their vigilance. Kurniawan's various identities were no longer enough. Kyle Smith realized that his friend could get caught, so in March 2012, he tried to prevent it.
I did contact Rudy a day or 2 before the FBI raided him, asking him if there's anything I should know, because I've been talking to the FBI and I don't want to falsely incriminate you, but from what I know or from what I feel, something's not right here. And he told me that if he was concerned about anything, that he would be on the next flight home to Asia. And that factored into his denial of bail.
Rudy Kurniawan didn't even realize that his scam had now collapsed. 2 days later, the prosecutor ordered the search of his home in Los Angeles.
I told them, careful, you're going to arrest him. Be careful. Don't let him go with just a caution. He has 9 passports. If you let him leave under such pressure, he'll jump on the first plane with a different passport and you'll lose him.
The 8th of March 2012, at dawn. the Asian quarter of Arcadia was still sleeping peacefully. At 6 in the morning, several cars surrounded the forger's house. The FBI banged on the door, and long minutes passed before anything happened.
They were pounding on the door for quite a long time and they were not getting a response. But just before they were going to take action to actually knock down the door was opened by Rudy Kurniawan. And from what I understand, I think that he had probably been sleeping. He was upstairs and had to come down to open the door.
The house search began, and what the police discovered was worthy of a crime film. In the entrance, from floor to ceiling, piles of stacked up wine crates. The kitchen had been transformed into a counterfeiting laboratory, and the windows were covered to conceal the activity. Counterfeiting utensils were placed on the edge of the sink. As the FBI moved around the house, the evidence mounted.
We even found some bottles in the kitchen sink that had been filled with water so that the labels could soak off. There were bottles in almost every room of the house, and they were in different stages of being counterfeited. Some didn't have labels, some only had wax, and really in every turn of the house we found corks, and we found more and more evidence that this was very, very clearly the spot where Rudy Kurniawan made his counterfeit wine.
In the drawers, 19,000 labels representing the 27 best wines in the world. This cupboard was completely filled with spray adhesive to stick them. Dozens of stamps bearing the logos of the biggest domains, hundreds and hundreds of corks of Grand Cru, and 200 bottles stacked on the shelves, the ground, in every corner of the house. That day, Rudy Kurniawan remained silent.
Rudy, I think, was surprised to be arrested. I don't think he had any idea that the FBI was going to arrest him. But he didn't confess, and he really didn't say anything to the FBI the morning of the arrest. He mostly chose to remain silent, which is his right.
Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Kurniawan was immediately arrested and sent to a detention center in Brooklyn, New York. And Michael Egan was urgently called to appraise all the bottles and the thousands of labels found in the house. The expert has exceptionally agreed to reveal some pieces of evidence found in the counterfeiter's home.
This is a fake label of Clos de la Roche, labels created with a sticky back which you just peel off and put onto the bottle like that.
If there was no doubt for this type of self-adhesive label, he had to do a Herculean task for the thousands of others. The fraud was so well executed that hours of research were spent looking for the slightest detail to prove the imitation.
I have here a digital microscope. I've already got a picture of a real Chateau Cheval Blanc label here, which you can see the gold quite clearly. And on the Kurniawan, it looks pretty good, but it's not as clear or crisp when you have it on the magnification as the real label. This is a fake Chateau Petrus magnum size. This paper, we know, all comes from a printer in Indonesia. The name of the company is Concord. And here you can just see the C and the O. It's very, very hard to see, but you can just see the C or the O here. And this company only began printing in 1982, or producing paper, sorry, in 1982. So there's no way a company created in 1982 could create an original Chateau Petrus label.
For weeks, the expert checked over 200 bottles signed by Kurniawan. Each batch of labels was carefully scrutinized to dissemble the counterfeiting techniques one by one. Late 2013, the file was finally ready. The case is the United States versus Rudy Kurniawan. On the 9th of December 2013, the forger's trial began in New York. After over 20 months behind bars, Kurniawan looks nothing like the high-powered and irreproachable man he was when he was arrested. The forger's face had changed. He was now calm and silent.
He lost a lot of weight in prison. He looked gaunt. Rudy Kurniawan had this chubby face with plump cheeks, but he was really emaciated. He was wearing big black glasses which were eating his face.
And most importantly, he didn't seem to realize the magnitude of the charge. Dozens of witnesses took the stand. The forged bottles were displayed one by one, and the charges fell progressively. But the accused showed no signs of remorse.
Our eyes met, of course, and he smiled at me and gave me a nod and a sign of complicity. But already from the benches at the back of the room, I'd had a feeling, which was confirmed to me at that point, that he was in complete denial of reality.
He was very relaxed. He was scribbling things. He seemed quite detached from what was happening. From time to time, he'd cast a glance around without really worrying about anything whatsoever.
The inability to recognize that he had been exposed until the end, until the moment the axe falls. This is actually denial.
Kurniawan was denying reality. Almost unsurprisingly, he pleaded not guilty. But with the clear evidence found at his home, it was hard for his lawyers to form a strong defense.
They charged him with having sold counterfeit wines through auction and in private sale to a number of different individuals, and then they charged him with having made misrepresentations in obtaining a $3 million loan from a finance company. Well, he said not guilty. I mean, that's the way our system works. So he said, I'm not guilty, and then it became the government's obligation to prove it. And from there we started the fight.
Rudy Kurniawan's lawyers had great difficulty in finding a line of defense. Rudy pleaded not guilty, so they had to provide proof that he wasn't guilty. 19,000 labels, fake labels of Grand Cru, were found in his home. His lawyer, Jérôme Mooney, explained that these labels had been used to line the walls of his new home, because he was such a wine lover that he wanted a tapestry made from thousands of Grand Cru labels. That obviously made the judges, the audience, the lawyers laugh. There really was no defense.
The scammer could have been sentenced to 40 years in prison. It was eventually 10. On the 8th of August 2013, the verdict finally fell.
And just as the verdict was announced, I kept my eyes on him because I really wanted to see his reaction. I was right behind him. I thought I could feel his shoulders fall a little at that point, as if he realized, that's it. I'm doomed. He wanted to play to the end, and he'd obviously lost. A complete mystery remains around Rudy Kurniawan. We have no idea what his past is, what his personality is.
In this story, Rudy Kurniawan fell alone. Did he have any accomplices, or did he act without anyone's help? If everyone has their own idea on the matter, only Rudy Kurniawan knows the truth. As for the bottles created by the forger, it's impossible to know how many lie dormant in the cellars of the biggest collectors and are still circulating in auctions.